Hello, and welcome to the presentation and discussion of the 45th statement of the Latin American Committee on Macroeconomic and Financial Issues, CLAF for its acronym in Spanish. I'm Liliana Rojas Suarez. I'm the chair of the committee. I am accompanied today by the committee members and the authors of the statement. In alphabetical order, they are Laura Alfaro, the Warren Albert Professor of the Harvard Business School, former Minister of National Planning and Economic Policy from Costa Rica. Guillermo Calvo, Professor from Columbia University, former Chief Economist at the Inter-American Development Bank. José de Gregorio, Professor of Economics, University of Chile, former Governor of the Central Bank of Chile and former Ministry of Economy, Mining and Energy. Pablo Guidotti, Professor of the Government School, University of Torquato di Tella, and a former Minister of Economy from Argentina. And Andrés Velasco, Dean of the School of Public Policy, London School of Economics, and former Minister of Finance of Chile. Ernesto Talvi, Senior Fellow, Real Instituto Elcano in Madrid, former Executive Director of CERES, and former Minister of Foreign Relations from Uruguay. We'll start today's program with a brief presentation of our statement that will be followed with a conversation with our CLAF members. Two housekeeping points before we start. First, we're going to have simultaneous translation into Spanish, so just choose the relevant YouTube channel. And second, if you have questions for our presentation as well as during the discussion with the panelists, please submit them to events@cgdep.org, or you can tweet at cgdep, at cgdeptalks, or submit your comments via YouTube. So first, to start with the presentation, a brief presentation of our statement, I would like to share a PowerPoint with you that summarized our discussion. So we called this statement, which, as I said, is the 45th statement. So we've been a long time making statements about the important issues for the region. But this one, we call it defeating inflation, and we call it Latin America's most immediate challenge, recognizing that, of course, there are many issues that are very important for the region, but that this is a one that is really pressing. So the first thing that we did in the committee in our deliberations is that we noticed that inflation is, of course, as we all know, a synchronized phenomenon affecting the entire world. And the result has been due to two causes, and both associated with a policy response of factors that took place during the COVID crisis. The first one, that is the one that everybody knows and is so much circulated in the press, is that the lockdowns and mobility constraints around the world generated these supply chain constraints, implying a supply shock for key economic sectors, and that was a supply shock that basically depressed the availability of demand. But another very important reason behind this synchronized problem of inflation, and one that the committee put a lot of emphasis on, is that what was the response, the policy response of the fiscal and monetary authorities in the United States and other advanced economies. What happened is that during COVID, the expansion of monetary aggregates by this graph on the left showed the expansion of the assets, the ratio of assets to GDP by the Fed. And the one on the right shows the expansion of central bank assets in the euro area, again as a percentage of GDP. During the COVID crisis, that expansion of the balance sheets of the central banks really expanded significantly, much more than it had during the period of the global financial crisis, you see in both cases. But during the COVID crisis, it really ballooned, right? And for us, this huge expansion of monetary aggregate is key to explain the high and persistent level of inflation. Now, the reaction of the Fed, in our view, was quite delayed and insufficient. So let me tell you a little bit of how the committee saw the story, right? In mid-2021, the increase in inflation that had already started to manifest was assessed as temporary and attributed to the supply side factors that I just mentioned. There was not sufficient consideration to the quick recovery of aggregate demand. And this graph summarizes it all. This is the behavior of real personal consumption expenditure. And the reason why we are showing consumption here is because consumption accounts in the United States for about 70% of GDP, right? So if something affects consumption, it's going to affect significantly what happens in GDP. So this is a line that shows that behavior from the early 2000s. But the point that I want to make is that there was a huge difference in the behavior of consumption during the global financial crisis relative to what happened in COVID. During the global financial crisis, there was a significant deterioration in consumption that was persistent. So if consumption were going to be predicted from before the global financial crisis, you would have said that this would have been the trend line. Well, after the global financial crisis, that trend actually declined. And so there was, when the expansion of monetary aggregates took place during the global financial crisis, there was no need for inflation pressures to manifest because aggregate demand had depressed, okay? But when we go to the period of the global financial crisis, there is again, during the period of COVID, there is again a sharp decrease in consumption, but it recovers very quickly and goes back to trend. So the expansion of the aggregates of the monetary aggregate that I had shown you, right, were certainly creating a huge impact on aggregate demand. And of course, that manifested in inflation that was persistent. So even though inflation surfaced in May 2021, that's a long time ago, the Fed only started to increase interest rates in March 2022, and only by 25 basis points. So by June 2022, we had inflation at almost 9%, right, which is the highest figure in nearly 4 decades. Now, how that it translated, that inflation, into Latin America, which is the center of our discussion? Well, the first thing is that raising U.S. inflation translated in higher imported inflation in Latin America due to the dominant role of the U.S. dollar in the invoicing of global trade, which of course also manifests in the dominance of the US dollar on financial transactions, as you can see in the graph right here, where the US dollar accounts for the lion's share of trades between currencies in the world. The second reason is that as inflation was rising in the United States, there was, of course, expectation that eventually the Fed was going to be increasing interest rates, which it did. And it led to these capital outflows as the risk sentiment for risky assets deteriorated. And so that led to capital outflows and currency depreciations in Latin America, which of course fueled inflationary pressure through the transmission from exchange rate depreciation into inflation. And finally, there were also large fiscal expansions in the regions as a response to the economic effects to COVID, and they were not quickly reversed as consumption recovered. So you have a number of factors, most of them external factors, but we also recognize that there were dominant elements that contributed to that. However, the policy response in Latin America relative to the policy response in the United States was quite different. Look, what the red line is the increases or the movements of interest rates in the United States. As I mentioned, the first response occurred only in March 2022, so March of this year, and was very timid, right? In contrast, in a number of countries in Latin America, the perception that inflation was rising and the region had no space to tolerate inflation implied that central banks responded very quickly, and this is, for example, Brazil, that in early 2021 started increasing inflation, but several other countries like Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru followed suit too, right? So the response to inflation was much more, was faster and more timely. Now, what are the prospects of inflation, right? What we observe right now is that in a number of countries, central bank efforts are actually yielding results. Inflation has started to decline in the last couple of months. But of course, we always have to emphasize that this is not the case for all countries in the region, right? We have countries like Argentina and Venezuela with persisting inflation that goes beyond the explanation that we can have of what happened during COVID because there's endemic inflation there. So the committee set a baseline scenario, right? Which can be characterized by two points. The first one is that the Fed and Euro will be actually effective in bringing down inflation. Okay, that's the baseline scenario. Point number one, through their decrease in global liquidity, through quantitative tightening, both the Fed and the Europeans are going to control global inflation, right? And the second one is that there's not going to be sudden stops of capital flows. If that's the case, then we are reducing the external effects of inflation, of global inflation affecting Latin America. And so we believe that in that scenario, inflation will start falling more rapidly in the coming months. Now, what are the policy implications of this assessment? The first one is that still the global scenario is extremely uncertain. In that case, the central banks, the committee believes, needs to be very cautious in not removing its tightening policy very fast. It has to have strong signals and evidence that inflation is receding. A problem in Latin America is that there is not really too much room for inflation. History has shown that when inflation is high in Latin America, usually the perception of investors about what is happening in the economic activity actually deteriorates further, which is accompanied many times with recessions. So we believe that the central banks should maintain their current tight stance. The second one, equally important, is we don't think that the burden of policy readiness to a volatile environment should rely only on the shoulders of the central banks. We think that when you have very quite volatile capital markets and there is a risk of sudden stop of capital, debt markets could be subject to strong volatility. And so fiscal policy, local fiscal policies need to play a complementary role. For that reason, we believe that a smaller structural budget deficit and liquidity buffers should be there to reduce financial vulnerability. Also, we think that coordination across government institutions, and by that we mean the finance minister, the central bank, state-owned enterprise, sometimes the banking system regulators, if that is necessary, the government institutions need to coordinate their policy response well in advance. They have to have a plan of reaction so that policies can be implemented when they are needed. And this is basically because what we're observing right now is a huge volatility in monetary aggregates of the reserve currencies in a way that has not been observed since World War II. And this is reflected in the large appreciation of the dollar, which of course have reversed a little bit, but just a little bit in the last days. But this graph shows the real effective behavior of the real exchange rate. And the appreciation of the dollar is very large. In addition, the committee believes that political support for policy actions is essential. We'll discuss more of this during the conversation with the panelists. But in a very polarized region like Latin America, we need to boost confidence investors in local policies by getting the political support. And finally, a very important part of the statement focus on what we think the role of multilateral organizations should be. So we basically stated that all indicators show that debt in emerging markets and in Latin America have reached record level as a result of the responses of the pandemic. Not surprisingly, of course, given the nature of the shock. But second, that even though financial contagion from emerging markets that have run into problems have not materialized yet. For example, and we cite this in the committee, the default of Sri Lanka has not translated in defaults of many other emerging markets economies because of their strong fundamentals. But we cannot discard the possibility of financial contagion if international financial conditions are going to tighten further. Because of these two conditions or characteristics, the committee believes that there is a very important role for the international official community to reduce debt levels in emerging markets. Specifically, we have a proposal, and we'll be discussing that too in the conversation, that it would be very efficient and effective to have the IMF involved in day buybacks as part of its programs. So what we are saying is we need to have a specific amount of the entire program that IMF is designing for a particular program dedicated specifically for debt buybacks. Why? Because we think that would ensure that fund resources, IMF resources, are going to be directly to achieve debt sustainability. We have the example of Argentina, right, where a significant amount of the resources from the IMF were actually used for short-term expenditure, when the real problem is a problem of debt, and the real problem has to be tackled, which is reducing the debt. So by involving the IMF directly into debt reductions, then we could guarantee that the fund resources will be used to what is the most important problem. And that, of course, complements the second point, which is right now in the world, even though we need one, there is not a mechanism for orderly debt restructuring. There is not. So these IMF-driven buybacks could be an efficient tool to de facto actually restructure debt and avoid the defaults. So these are basically the most important recommendations that we have in the statement, you are going to be able to find it, and at the end of the presentation, I'll tell you where to find the the statement. But now I would like to, I'm sure you have more questions than answers because I have just given a brief presentation. So I would like now to involve a discussion with the members and start asking some specific questions that develop what I've been saying further. So why don't I start with Guillermo Calvo. So Guillermo, in the statement, we emphasize the role of external factors on Latin American macro outcomes. And one important development, as we saw in one of the graphs, was the significant appreciation of the US dollar since 2020. If this appreciation were to persist, what do you think are the impacts for Latin America? You think that the region is ready to face a sustained appreciation of the dollar?
Well, it depends very much on the country involved, certainly. I mean, we've seen episodes of appreciation where the commodity prices were through the roof. So some countries in Latin America may benefit, at least momentarily, and we are already seeing that. But the thing that worries me the most is the impact of all of this on the, let's call it the credibility of these economies, because this is happening in a situation where there is actually a flight to the dollar. That's why the dollar is appreciating. So there is a tendency for funding to go to capital to flow out of Latin America, which complicates matters quite a bit. And we have a lot of literature showing that. In that context, I don't know what really works. We have to realize that this is very challenging. I'm not saying there is no solution, you have to do crazy things, no. But even increasing interest rate could be counterproductive. Maybe things that look heterodox may be the right thing to do. That puts some brakes on the outflow of capital, for example. I don't like it. But most importantly, I think whatever you do, and it's going to be hard to decide. I mean, sometimes I smile to myself when I hear keep on doing the same tough policies, like telling a constructor, look, there is an earthquake, but keep building that house, as if that was the solution. And we do sometimes that kind of, so we don't go to that extreme here, but we have to realize that we have to be walking on a very shaky ground, and the other things mentioned in your statement, which have to do with the participation of the fund and other multilateral institutions, could be even more fundamental, because you can do things that look crazy sometimes, but if you get imprimatur by the fund, that can go through and become part of the solution. But just unfortunately, and with this I finish, solutions that look like, let's try the interest rate, so the interest right now is positive. It could be an empty statement, because if you have an earthquake, you won't be able to pay the real interest rate. Let me start there.
Thank you, Guillermo. And well, you talk about earthquakes and weaknesses in the economy. So why don't we move to some specific country policies in Latin America? In the statement, we argue that it's not enough to focus on central bank policies and that efforts are needed in the fiscal front. And we also call for a coordinated action across government branches so that policies can complement each other. So, Laura, let me start with you on the specific country situations. What is your view on the need to further fiscal adjustments in Brazil? And how do you see prospects in the front? What positive achievement do you foresee, and what problems do you anticipate in light that we are now entering, a new period, right? It's a new government that is taking place in Brazil in January.
So thank you, Liliana. It's interesting that you mentioned Brazil. Is the one country in Latin America that doesn't have earthquakes?
It's true.
and apparently orthodox work, at least in monetary policy. In bad times, they loosen, and in good times, they tighten. They tighten even before other countries, and against perhaps even the advice of the IMF, and it worked. And so sometimes a problem in Latin America is not thinking out of the box, is sometimes not following the rules. And in case of inflation in Brazil worked, the vulnerability of Brazil continues to be fiscal. Right now, fiscal is close to 80% of GDP. It's a country that actually used a lot fiscal also during COVID, expanding more than 10% of GDP. However, before the election, they also expanded. And in fact, when you see the countries that use emergency tools because of the war, there's two countries, Ukraine and Brazil, just to give you a sense. So right now, the primary deficit is close to zero. They are expecting it to worsen to perhaps 2% of GDP, negative 2% of GDP, a mixture that some tax revenue that they had available before won't materialize. So, for example, Brazil reduced taxes to deal with the gas shock, the oil shock. Politically, it's unlikely that tax will come back, but that used to be a tax the Brazilians could rely on. So they're not going to have that in terms of taxes. And they increased just recently social spending. They doubled to one extra 1% of GDP. So the expectation is that the primary deficit is going to be minus 2% of GDP. Assuming Brazil grows 2%, which tends to be the average, Brazil requires a surplus of 2% of GDP to stabilize the debt. So unless they come up with 4 percentage points of GDP in taxes, the debt situation is going to worsen. Right now, they're a little bit on a honeymoon. No one is apparently paying a lot of attention. There's still not a minister of finance, but it's likely that there will be pressures to spend. They de facto are getting rid of the fiscal rule, which is a problem for them. So again, right now, the market is not paying a lot of attention. It is bizarre because Brazil is a country where the market tends to pay a lot of attention. I think they're just still celebrating that the inflation in the US was going down. But I think once things normalize, people are going to realize that the fiscal situation continues to be Brazil's vulnerability. And as I said, right now, in the short run, it doesn't look great.
Okay, quite a grim picture for the largest economy in the region, at least on the macro front. So why don't we move to smaller countries in the region and see how they are doing? Because perhaps there are some lessons we can learn from them. So Ernesto, talking about fiscal stimulus and debt, Uruguay is a very interesting case. The country has one of the highest debt level of public debt level in Latin America. And at the same time, the investor seems to love it. It has one of the smallest MV is the, just for our audience, just in case for clarification, is the a metric that measures the perception of risk by investors, one of the smallest MV spreads in the region. So how do you explain this puzzle?
It is actually the smallest, Liliana, in the region. And I would say that Uruguay's fiscal policy has been textbook optimal. So if there are any lessons that we can learn from Uruguay in the recent years, is that optimal policies are feasible to pursue. During the pandemic, Uruguay created a COVID fund to finance exceptional outlays, and they were completely segregated from the day-to-day operations of the government. And therefore, while we were expanding expenditures to deal with the COVID pandemic, at the same time, the government was reducing the structural deficit. So it is interesting that at the current levels of output, unemployment and inflation are very similar to those prevailing prior to the pandemic in 2019. Nonetheless, the fiscal deficit, the budget deficit is 1% below that of 2019. So actually the structural deficit shrunk. And at 2% of GDP today, it stabilizes the structural, the public debt dynamics at current levels. So that's the first aspect. And the second is that post-pandemic, Uruguay is about to enact a social security reform that, among other positive effects on the functioning of the system, it ensures long-run credibility. And this is for two reasons. First, and this is very key in the political environment we are living today, that it is a signal that the political system is willing and able to reach agreements to enact reforms like social security reform that are politically unpopular, that are complex, that are long run, in the sense that they will not benefit the current administration, but in any case, future administrations. And second, and this is, I think, a key aspect, social security reform reduces the implicit debt in unfunded pension liabilities, which is various orders of magnitude the level of the observed debt. So the fundamental reason why we see that apparent puzzle between having one of the highest observed public debt levels and the lowest country risk is that in Uruguay, what you don't see is what you get. It's all about the future. So if you look at the debt, it's high, but current structural deficit stabilizes the debt. It even reduces it a little bit. And social security reform reduces the implied debt in a very, very substantial way while leaving the observed debt unchanged. And I think it is the combination of these two facts that explain that apparent puzzle, which is not.
Thank you, Ernesto. Okay, so investors having forward-looking perceptions and expectations and the importance of reforms to actually generate those expectations, right? So let's move now to Jose and Chile talking about reforms because Chile right now has a proposal of reforms to the pension fund system on the table. The outcome of this reform is extremely important, not only for the economic impact and for its, but also for its social consequence, since as we know well, there was huge public discontent with the existing system, leading to social protest and large withdrawal of funds from the accounts in pension funds. So, Jose, do you think that the proposed reform will be able to increase domestic savings, which are much needed in the new environment of high interest rates with most challenging terms to external sources of funding?
Well, I think that there is as you mentioned, all the problems that Chile had, part of the turmoil and everything has been because we haven't made a deep pension reform. Pensions are still low, regardless that the system works, because people, the contributions are low. People contribute for a short period of time. And so at the end, I think that we end up with low pensions. So this is a reform that Chile is pending for almost 10 years. There is a lot of details and a lot of discussion that I think that is still long way. But what's clear is that the pension reform will attempt two things, I would say, regarding your concern. The first is that there is a consolidation of a component of fully funded system. So pensions will be increased by a contribution by 6 percentage points from 10 to 16. Those 6% is still, there is a discussion of whether it will be for a joint savings of the generation or personal savings. I don't want to go into the details, but there is at least a 10% that is individual account savings. This will reduce the possibility of having another withdrawal because now there is a commitment with a reform like we had a couple of years ago. It was extremely damaging for our capital markets. And this 6%, an important fraction of this, will go to some form of savings. So at the end, this reform will, and if goes through as proposed and with all the changes, will not only keep the current fully funded system, but will also add another layer of private savings.
And do you think that it actually will be very welcome by the general population in terms of, the social discontent that they had with the previous?
It's a very interesting the case of Chile. Everybody wants good pensions. Everybody wants solidarity and redistribution. But most of the people want that the new 6% go to their own personal accounts. So the political past is not trivial. I don't think that this is enough to kind of calm all the social unrest, but this is one of the key reforms that have been at the center of all problems and conflicts in Chile. So I think that this is part of things that we have to do, and it's a very important part, but of course it's not enough.
Andres, I have two questions for you, but being a Chilean, the first question, I would like to see whether you agree with Jose's statements about the pension system reform in Chile and especially whether it will have the desired social impact. And then I'm going to move to another question, more general on the role of the multilateral organizations. But can you first see where we stand? You're muted.
Sorry about that. I agree fully with Jose that Chile needs a pension reform, and there are a number of elements in the proposed reform that I tend to agree with. The notion of separating fund management from back office, introducing more competition, raising the threshold, the percentage of a monthly wage that is saved. All those are good and desirable ideas. There is one conceptual issue about which I think we can have a further discussion. It is clear that the transition generation, people retiring in the next 2 or 3 decades, because they saved little in the past, if nothing is done, would have low pensions. Someone will have to help them pay for better pensions. The current reform says it will be savers in the pension system who will help subsidize the new retirees. That's one possibility. It's not the only possibility. You could also imagine general taxpayers providing the subsidy. I can imagine why the call it social or humanitarian effect is the same, but perhaps the incentives and the efficiency aspects could be different. It is not an easy matter. It is not a settled matter, but it is one that will require discussion. But overall, yes, we do need a pension reform. Will it end unrest? Well, that question makes sense if we think that pensions are the main source of unrest. I don't believe that is the case. Pensions are a big issue. Surely plenty of people have been retiring with very low pensions, but the people who were throwing stone and burning subway stations and buses in Chile in late 2019 were not 65-year-olds about to retire. They were not their children. They were typically their grandchildren. So issues of political legitimacy, of youth employment, of youth training, of discrimination, those would seem to me to be more urgent and more important if what we want to avoid is further social unrest.
Thank you. So turning back to the theme of the effects of the global economy on Latin America, in the statement, we suggest that there's an important role for multilateral organizations. And we have a specific proposal. I'll turn to Pablo in a minute to expand on that proposal. But first, Andres, continuing with you, even with the multitude of global shocks that have affected emerging markets and Latin America, the financial support of multilateral organizations have been quite limited. What else do you think can be done in that front? In your view, do you think it will actually be done? Will the multilaterals actually move the needle?
Well, let's first agree on what ought to be done. It seems to me that there are at least 3 lines of action for priority. The first one is to continue and strengthen access to emergency liquidity. I think the fund has taken some step forwards in this respect. During COVID, a number of central banks in the region, including Chile's, had access to special liquidity lines. Not everybody did. Some countries that could have accessed them chose not to, maybe because of stigma effects, maybe because of costs. So the first issue is, can we continue working on the development of such liquidity lines to make sure that when countries in times of stress need dollars, they can get their hands on those dollars? Second is the issue that Paulo no doubt will be explaining in greater detail. One could imagine the multilaterals, and in particular the fund, taking a leading role in helping countries reduce debt. We're not talking about debt forgiveness here. We're not talking about debt cancellation. These are middle income and upper middle income countries. We're talking about using the market smartly, perhaps with enhancements coming from multilaterals, to reduce the stock of debt in a way that is non-traumatic and non-disruptive. And the third thing that I would mention, it goes beyond short-term macro, but it remains very important. Countries will have to undergo a green transition to make their contribution to stop global warming. And of course, the growth transition is not only good for altruistic reasons, it is also good because increasingly export markets will require exports with a low carbon content, and because green investment can create jobs. Having said that, the question is, who will pay for all of this? If fiscal space, as Guillermo and others said, is very limited. You also said so, Liliana. If fiscal space is very limited, how do you pay for a green transition, do more green infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera? Well, here clearly, there's room for greater public-private cooperation, and the multilaterals have been talking about, but haven't quite yet delivered, on innovative mechanisms, co-financing, de-risking, partial guarantees, etc., that can help catalyze private flows, bring not simply loans to the government, but private investment into the, broadly speaking, green transition sector. That helps with exports, it helps with global warming, it also helps with growth. There's been a lot of talk about this, not a lot of action yet. The time has come to provide the details, provide the specifics, and move forward.
Excellent. So, Pablo, Andres, and just mentioned that the time for details and more specific recommendation is now. And in our statement, we argue that we cannot discard the risk of systemic disruption in the flow of capital to emerging markets, including Latin America. That is, we cannot discard the risk of financial contagion. But an event like this would occur at a time when debt levels are quite elevated, especially since emerging markets had to issue large amounts of debt to deal with the effects of the pandemic. So in the statement, we argue that in that context, there is a very specific role for an IMF intervention involving debt buybacks from these countries. Can you elaborate a bit on the proposal?
Yes, thank you, Iliana. As you mentioned, today we are facing a situation in which debt levels are record, both in advanced economies as well as in emerging and developing economies. And this is part the result of the policy response to the pandemic. But of course, we are entering with the inflation and the need to respond to global inflation, we are maybe entering a new normal with significantly higher levels of interest rates, which may complicate then the situation more than what people anticipated during the last long period, I would say, since the global financial crisis, where interest rates have been very low, and the problem was more one of deflation. Right? So in the present context, certainly for a number of emerging and developing economies, there is the risk that they may face significant capital market volatility. And the question is, why would we need a systemic response as we are proposing involving the IMF? Well, we think that this is necessary because higher debt levels are not only a problem of individual countries, but they are a problem of the system. Because as we have experienced in previous situations, when we have a capital market volatility and high debt levels, then we can have a financial contagion, we can have multiple equilibria, and the economy might actually locate into an equilibrium which is worse than what is possible. So there is an externality which is not only affects a country specifically, but actually might have systemic effect. Also, we think that there are distortions at the country levels, at the level of the incentives that government have, which may be corrected or may be addressed by the proposal that we are doing. This is particularly important for countries that may need significant access to IMF resources, what is called the exceptional access, where often debt levels are considered to be sustainable but with low probability. So what we are essentially proposing is that the IMF devotes a portion of the resources that disburses under its programs to specifically the implementation of debt buybacks. This actually is a proposal that goes directly to solving the issue of debt sustainability, or contributing to make debt sustainable. Why this cannot be done through the normal programs that we have today, where the country actually has access and decides what to do with resources? Well, often countries governments have a myopic sort of approach. They wish to use the resources they get from the fund for their immediate needs and solutions. And they tend to sort of leave to the future administrations the solution of the debt problem. We have seen this in cases such as Argentina, but this is part of how even the IMF conceives its role. Often the IMF conceives its role as a catalytic role that actually provides a lot of money, and then the country accesses the capital market, and with that access repays the fund. And that doesn't happen. And there is where we see that many of these big IMF programs do not work, because they do not devote a portion of these resources to actually solving what is generating the underlying weakness. And as we have said, this weakness is not only important at the country level, but also has this external effect on other countries. So I think that this is essentially, in my view, is in a certain sense, a novel proposal, but one has to work out the details because, of course, the situation of each country is different. But if you tell me, for instance, the case of Ecuador, a country with solid policies where debt is incredibly devalued at this point, where it has a dollarized economy which actually contributes to stability, I think that is a country that actually is ending an IMF program at the end of this year, so it has the ability to renegotiate a new program. Well, maybe it's a country that would be one of the prime examples to benefit from debt buybacks financed by the fund to be able to help the country reaccess the capital market in a short period of time.
Thank you very much, Pablo. Yes, as you just said in the statement, we make this proposal that I hope will bring much more discussion because, as you said, there are many details that still have to be ironed out. And of course, the intention of our proposal is to put that discussion on the table, since everybody agrees that debt is a big problem, but really specific solutions on how to deal with the problems are not totally fully conceived yet, right? So we are running quickly out of time, so I like to move to very short but specific questions with our panelists, with common questions, right? First, going back to the inflation in Latin America, the center of our discussions, for Laura, Ernesto, and Jose, will the central banks of Brazil, Uruguay, and Chile, respectively, be able to bring inflation down without exacerbating recession? That's the part of the question that is important. 2 minutes each, please. So first, Laura, in Brazil.
So as I had mentioned, Brazil, the central bank earned a lot of credibility and respect for being the first central bank to act, because again, they understood that the origin of the problem was a demand, not supply. And they now see the effects that inflation is coming down. All of these while transitioning from being dependent to independent central bank. So again, now they have the credibility, they have the central bank independence. Let's also keep in mind that in Brazil, inflation doesn't win votes. It's a very regressive tax. It doesn't win votes. And so the combination of these three things, I think, will allow them to continue to fight inflation. Whether so far it has not created recession, it will depend on how the government acts. But again, in the past, these incentives have aligned government spending. And so hopefully this will put a break. And I do hope that the multilaterals also support countries that are trying to maintain sustainability, as opposed to the narrative that they have now, that they seem just to try to get countries to spend more and not worry about the implications.
Great. Ernesto, what about Uruguay? You are muted.
Sorry about that. I think Uruguay fits the picture for Latin America in general, with the exceptions that we already mentioned in the statement: Argentina, Venezuela, where the inflationary problems have another origin, another type of dynamics. Central banks in the region did a very good job in trying to deal with the inflationary problem, and they did it early on, even before the developed world did it, as we already said. So there's, absent any accident, the job is going to be done, and it's going to be well done. We might revert back sooner rather than later to the levels we had pre-pandemics. But we are going to see a very bumpy road. I mean, the road is going to be bumpy because the US is processing a race between stocks, the supply and the demand for money that can still give us some surprises. And we are going to see along the road some financial accidents in the way we saw in the UK, and we are now seeing in the crypto industry and somewhere else, we don't know, that eventually will, I don't know, put some tensions in the capital markets, bring some turbulence. And we know by the work we did with Guillermo Calvo and Alejandro Izquierdo that if you have some sort of interruption in capital flows, sudden interruption in capital flows, then that comes associated with sharp contractions and a spike in inflation. Mm-hmm. So assuming away any accident in capital markets, I would believe that we are going to be a leading indicator of inflation convergence in the countries in the region.
Thanks, Ernesto. And Jose, how do you see Chile?
Yeah, I think that the two things, I don't like to say, like you posted this, whether this will exacerbate the recession. I think that the central banks have two choices, or they cause this acceleration today, or if inflation builds up, it will cause a much more costly deceleration in the future to stop inflation when it is rising. So I think that in Latin America in general, and Chile in particular, the monetary tightening starts very early, much before than in advanced economies. They, in most countries, and in Chile, they have reached the highest rate. All rates are up 10% in many countries in the region, Chile, Brazil. I think that is so at the end, the issue, I think that they have done well. We are observing, and there are some signals that inflation may start declining. However, it is too early to declare victory. And I think that the central banks are playing by the book. They are doing early tightening, reinforcing credibility and everything, and avoiding a much deeper deceleration. However, we don't have history. Since inflation came down in Latin America 20, 25 years ago to 1 digit, inflation was conquered. We haven't had an experience of such a massive increase in inflation with a lot of supply shocks, and without knowing exactly how the persistence will be. So I think that we are doing our best. We don't have the history to see how it will replicate. Fortunately, in the case of Chile, and I think that in the case of most macroeconomically stable countries in the region, there are no additional pressures like, say, current account imbalances with fixed exchange rate that are the best forecast for a currency crisis and more inflation, or public finance, despite being very challenging, public finance are not a source of additional inflation. So I think that is, at least from the point of view of finance. So I think that I am moderately optimistic, and I hope that doing what was supposed that they have to do, they are able to control inflation.
So thank you, Jose. Very, very positive view from our panelists regarding the different behavior of countries, at least with respect to the behavior of the central banks. So let me ask a question for Guillermo and Andres. Since the statement emphasized the need for coordination between government institutions to navigate the huge uncertainty in international capital markets, do you think that such coordination would be possible in the currently highly polarized political environment in the region? Guillermo first. You're muted, Guillermo.
Sorry. Well, it's quite a challenging thing. And we've seen it all the time whenever there is a serious difficulty, once the authorities are trying to carry out maybe a very good policy. The opposition can always gain sometimes by putting something into the system so that it slows down. And so that's a problem we have to live with. And I think in connection with what was said before, it was very uplifting what I heard about our colleagues that inflation seems to have been understood and nobody wants to play games with that. And I think that's going to be possible if the other factors that were also mentioned by this speaker, which is the capital markets getting a little bit haywire, crazy, when that happens, all bets are off. Mm-hmm. So even because the problem now exceeds the inflationary difficulties. So the good news that I get from that discussion is that don't worry too much about the political fight about inflation. If there is the other part, the other system is more or less stable. But one has to be prepared to the case where things get unstable all of a sudden because of some big shock outside, which seems to be ready to happen. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. And I think I tend to call the call for action for that is like a fire drill that you do prior to the things happening. The problem with the fire drills, nobody gets crazy because you say there could be a fire here. But if you say in an economy, look, we are doing this to get ready in case there is a fire, you don't know if that's going to cause the fire because it is human fire that provokes those fires and expectations and so on. So I don't know how to fix that. Let me end with one thing. We've been referring to Latin America, but the problems are coming from outside. And they become so high, so strong, so universal that we haven't seen it before. We've seen wars in the past, but we haven't seen episodes where people want to run from euros to dollars massively. And the evidence that we are discussing these days is quite amazing, and you don't have a precedent for that. So it's a world that where the shocks, contrary to the supply shocks that we are more familiar with, are coming from something totally unphysical, like money, forms of money. So what we are saying, the appreciation of the dollar is a result of a flight to the dollar. It's not that you want more meat from Argentina or less soybean from Brazil. It's that people want to move their funding from euros to dollars. And we haven't seen that because a few years ago, we didn't even have the euros. And I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Guillermo, and thank you for reminding us of the bottom line of our statement, right? Among the importance of external factors affecting the dynamics of inflation in the region. Andres, so with that call for action from Guillermo too and his remarks, do you think that necessary coordination between government branches or government authorities will be possible in the highly politically polarized environment?
Well, Guillermo began by saying it would be a challenge, and I am going to agree. But let me add one thought on what kind of cooperation we're talking about. You know, cooperation is one of those things that one cannot be against. It's a good thing. But what should the government and the central bank cooperate over? Let me suggest one narrow but very important objective. Countries have to get the right monetary and fiscal mix. It is clear today that demand expanded too far It expanded at a time of adverse supply shocks. And the combination of supply and demand forces gave us the kind of inflation we are going through. Clearly, demand has to be constrained to bring inflation down. But if we allow the central bank to do all the heavy lifting, and fiscal policy, which had to be expansionary during the pandemic, remains too expansionary after the pandemic, we know what happens. We have seen that movie before. It is one in which money has to be very tight, fiscal remains loose, and as a result, domestic interest rates are higher than they need be. And once confidence begins to be reestablished, capital flows in, the exchange rate appreciates. A little bit of appreciation may be good, but too much appreciation, nominal and real, eventually means less exports of the traditional kind, less dynamism, less growth. So Jose rightly said that the choice is not between having a recession or not having a recession, having less demand or not having less demand. Rightly, as he put it, the question is, do we have tight policies today, or do we have even tighter policies in the future? To avoid the syndrome of tighter policies in the future, and to ensure that inflation abatement is followed by a recovery and growth, we need the right fiscal monetary mix. And that in turn requires cooperation. Am I optimistic about that cooperation? Well, that depends on the country, of course. I will not opine on all countries. I'll say one sentence about my own. I think Chile has a finance minister who used to be the budget director. And as such, he's very clear on the importance of a sound fiscal policy. So at least when it comes to Chile, I would be reasonably optimistic in this regard. I wish I could be as optimistic about every other country in the region.
Thank you, Andres. Well, okay, I'm going to take a huge risk, and I hope the risk doesn't fire us back. But, all conferences, all events end with a positive note. But I want Pablo to talk a little bit about Argentina. And the reason is because I cannot have two Argentinas in the panel and not even mention what's happening in Argentina. So the question is, having listened to everything that you have from the different country perspective, can you help us to end at this event with a positive note on Argentina?
It's not easy.
Try.
But let me say that I'm optimistic about the prospects of lower inflation in the US and lower or a faster decline in the region. But as we said, Argentina really has domestic problems and domestic causes of inflation, which essentially reflect a large deficit that cannot be financed. Argentina doesn't have access to the international capital market and has to rely either on domestic debt or on monetary financing, and has been doing both with an increasing difficulty of financing the deficit with domestic debt. So I cannot be optimistic because currently still the government is relying on very tight restrictions on capital controls and very tight restrictions on imports, which will certainly slow down economic activity and will complicate things. But if I have to be optimistic, I would say the IMF has to recognize that the program that currently has with Argentina has been badly conceived, badly designed, and needs to be renegotiated with a much stronger fiscal target for next year. I think that Argentina needs to consolidate its fiscal accounts from what is in the current IMF program to essentially at least a 2% primary surplus for 2023. In El Diario La Nación, tomorrow, there will be an article of mine which actually discusses this, the outlook for inflation in Argentina. So if Argentina decides to correct its policies and the fund too, in that case, I would become more optimistic. If not, I think that both the government, with the auspices of the IMF, will actually end up in another crisis.
Thank you, Pablo. Well, I did not succeed in having an ending with a positive note, but as you can appreciate, the diversity of the region deserves all kinds of views and on different topics. We just totally ran out of time. For those of you that are interested in reading our statement, please, you'll find them in our webpage, claf.org/statements. And also at www.cgdebt.org/Latinoamerica. So it's been a pleasure to chair this panel with my fellow members of CLAF. And I thank you, all of you, for being participants in this conference. And we welcome you to our next presentation, which will be statement 46 of CLAF. Thank you all, and goodbye.